So moving on to long-term memory. Let's really get into the last part of Atkinson and Shiffrin's model, which is how we store things permanently. So we ended last time talking about working memory and short-term memory as this temporary store that does all the processing. So where does it go when it's permanent? And that's long-term memory. So long-term memory is the last piece of Atkinson and Shiffrin, and it has a relatively permanent store that's so the duration is unlimited, and the capacity is also unlimited. So to remind you of what we did before, we talked about sensory memory. The capacity is fairly unlimited, but the duration is very short. Short-term memory, the capacity is limited, 7 plus or minus 2, and then the duration is also pretty short, 30 seconds. But with long-term memory, you don't have any of that. The capacity is unlimited, and the duration is fairly unlimited as well. We'll get into forgetting in the next sections. We'll talk about what happens when you don't remember things. And so long-term memory is things that can be consciously retrieved, and then some other types of long-term memory that aren't conscious, that operate outside of awareness. And it's acquired in a bunch of different ways, but we're going to spend a lot of time talking about how it gets in, that's encoding, and then how it comes out, that's retrieval. So that's the last piece of Atkinson and Shiffrin. The arrow going from short-term to long-term is encoding. The arrow going from long-term to short-term is retrieval. So really let's think about the types of long-term memory. So we did working memory as a type of short-term memory, iconic and echoic as a type of sensory memory. And so the pieces of long-term memory differ in their basic processing, so how we use them, as well as the brain pieces that support those systems. So getting back to a little bit of the hippocampus stuff we started earlier. They break down into two types, declarative and non-declarative. Let's get into this giant picture here. Okay, so here on the left side are the declarative memories. Little pin icon is not working. There it goes. So our declarative memory is things that we can declare, hence the name. So it's called the explicit memory system, which means these are things we're conscious, we're aware of. The non-declarative system over here on the right is the implicit system, the things that we're not aware of that we do, or they're sort of automatic. We'll talk a little bit about priming. Procedural memory, we're going to cover a lot in expertise. Classical conditioning you've all heard before, but we'll do just a little bit of classical conditioning. And then non-associative learning, this is sort of automatic habituation or reflexes that you have. So declarative memory and non-declarative memory. Okay, so the declarative memory system, which is the explicit system, is long-term memory that is consciously recalled and declared. Okay, so facts, ideas, events, what did you have yesterday for lunch? That's declarative. We break declarative into two pieces: episodic memory, which is our mental diary, so personal past, and semantic memory, which is our mental dictionary, facts, general knowledge about the world. So all of that category stuff we talked about in the first section is part of semantic memory, whereas understanding that you have a dog, that would be episodic memory. This was Tulving's research. He was the first person to really make this distinction and then argued for procedural memory, which is the implicit side. And his episodic memory definition really talked a lot about how things either had dates or specific spaces, so like places you went. And so this was more of a distinction between knowing what a birthday cake is and knowing what type of cake I had for my 16th birthday. All right, so things that assess explicit memory are your general knowledge kinds of questions. So I show you a bunch of words to say, hey, what were those words? That's explicit. And this is a really flexible system that lets you, remember categories were quite complex. that lets you access memory from lots of different ways. So you can remember facts for a test by either remembering what they're associated to, or you can remember just straight definitions. You can come up with a story. So there's lots of ways to get at the same information. But both forms of declarative memory, episodic and semantic, are heavily dependent on the medial temporal lobe, which is right next to that hippocampus. So our declarative system, a little more about each one. Semantic memory is our fact-based knowledge, so it's the meanings of words, our mental dictionary, and it's encoded in gist format. So what do I mean by that? Gist format is the sort of, when someone asks you about something, you give them the gist, the overview. If I were to ask you about your favorite book, you wouldn't tell me all the little details. Okay, you would be tempted, but if I said, well, what's it about? Okay, so my favorite book is Orson Scott Card's Ender's Game. And so if you were to ask me, well, what's that about? I'm going to give you the like, oh God, that's so hard. It's about young children playing a game that isn't a game about aliens in space, which is not really what the book is about, but that's the gist format of what you might explain to someone. So just kind of think of as a summary. Episodic-based systems are more of our mental diary. So the idea is that we first learn a semantic memory system. So we learn what things are, what labels to apply to them, how they fit categorically with each other, and then we get episodic memory. So autobiographical memory, so memory about events in your life, don't start till like 3 or 4, or sometimes even later. So any memories that you have before that are actually probably false, implanted by your parents. Because you can't have a memory of a birthday if you didn't know what birthday was. So you have to build the dictionary system before you can build the diary system. So it's like trying to learn another language. You have to learn the the base, all the words, before you can start to build a more rich system, which is episodic memory. So some problems with episodic memory. Source amnesia occurs when you have the semantic memory. You remember the fact, but not the accompanying episodic memory, when and where or how you learned it. Okay, so it's a semantic memory, the fact, without the when and where of when you learned it. And that can be very serious, especially in the courtroom. So because of this tied system, what happens is that episodic memory is dependent on semantic memory, because I have to know what things are to be able to store a diary of them. But the semantic memory system isn't dependent on episodic. Now it helps, but it doesn't depend on it. So with that breakdown, you get some sort of interesting events where you can have fact-based learning without life-based learning, so to speak. Okay, so I could have where I can learn new facts, but I can't remember where I learned them. What that means is that you have very slow learning of that new information. It takes you a lot longer because you don't have the extra where and when you learned it to help out. Okay? So episodic memory really provides us an advantage to reduce interference, and we'll get into proactive and retroactive interference in the next section. But basically, it reduces the interference of old information overwriting new, and new information overwriting old, by helping us remember the when we learned it or how we learned it. So an example of how you can have one but not the other. So H.M. is a very famous case, and he has anterograde amnesia. And that's the inability to remember anything new. So he had his medial temporal lobes taken out. That's the piece right underneath the parietal lobe. And so after he had had this surgery, he showed that he couldn't learn any new events. So he couldn't remember who his doctors were. He couldn't remember that he had even had the surgery, that sort of thing. He also had a little bit of retrograde amnesia, where he forgot some of the events right before the surgery on his brain. So the important aspect of his amnesia is that it's temporally graded. So what that means is that the event, as the event was closer to the surgery, it was more likely to be forgotten. So we talked about the hippocampus being the refrigerator for memory, and they have to consolidate before you can take out the jello. This was one of the main supports for that. So once we took out the mediotemporal lobes, he lost all formation of new memories. So that clearly is a system, an episodic system, that helps me learn new information. But it also showed about how information is consolidated in that area, because I lost some of the old information too. So I took the jello out of the fridge before it was ready. Okay. So what he had surgery on was the hippocampus, which is in the medial temporal lobes, and that is here. And he had both of them removed, both the left and right side, because he had severe epilepsy. And there was damage to these sections, and by taking them out, it solved the epilepsy problem, but created new problems for him. And that's just what this is trying to show, is where the pieces were. So lesions here and the hippocampus. And so he had those taken out to help with the epilepsy. Okay. So this is an fMRI of his brain, and this is where the lesion occurred. So he no longer had that area. So this was a causal brain study, unintentionally, to help us understand how memory works after he started showing these effects after surgery. So, what was it about his memory system? We thought, oh, the medial temporal lobes are it for memory. If you don't have those, you're cooked. Which, if you think about, Memento is a really great example of this. 51st States, it would seem true, right? You get no episodic memory each time, and so you can't learn anything new. Nothing at all. Well, that's not true. You can still learn some fact-based memory, so some episodic memory, I'm sorry, some semantic memory, because remember, it's not dependent on episodic memory, but it certainly helps, because H.M. was able to learn some new tasks. Okay, it was really slow. And he also was able to learn some procedural tasks. So this is one of the studies that indicated that procedural memory was something else. And so that's like your muscle memory systems, like how do you ride a bike? If you ask someone how to do that, it's like, oh, you just do. Or how do you tie your shoes? So any kind of muscle-based task that you can't just explain to someone, or if you drive a stick shift car, how do you know when to shift? That sort of thing. And so what they had people do, or had him, and they have college students do this too, is a mirror tracing task. So what you get is the hand up here, and you're required to trace the shape. And then the next thing that happens is that you're required to trace the shape in the mirror. So you're seeing a reflection of it and you're tracing it. And that's really hard because it's backwards. So you're having to hold that mental picture in your head and remember to go the other way. So it's kind of a difficult task. So what they had him do was try it on a day. And so this is the first day. So he's doing pretty terrible the first time. Everybody does this terrible. It's really hard. And he slowly gets better at the task because you do. After some practice, you get better. On that second day, you see that an improved learning. So you don't do as well, but you slowly get better. On the third day, he's a pro. Check this out. Pretty flat. college students show the same pattern. And so people argue that this is a sort of evidence for procedural-based system, because if there were no memory available, you would get the same curve every day. He would start terrible and get better, then start terrible and get better. He'd never learn. But check it out. He does clearly learn how to do this across tasks, even though he will tell you, no, I've never done this before. Okay, so what we're going to do now is talk about how we can form memories. So we're going to talk about encoding into the long-term memory system, episodic, or semantic. Okay, so attention, some levels of processing, which is one of the example labs, some generation and spacing, more about the medial temporal lobe, and then consolidation. Alright, so what do I mean by encoding? Encoding is the process that we use to transform things in short-term memory, so information that's come in through the sensory memory system, and we are trying to put it into permanent storage. Encoding is how we make it permanent. Okay. Elaboration, excuse me. Excuse me. All right, so elaboration is when we are taking that information and connecting it to old pieces of information. So elaboration happens when you say, okay, well, I've learned this new thing in this class. How does that relate to the old things that I learned in my other classes? So as you take more and more psychology classes, if you're a major, what'll happen is you'll see that lots of things tend to repeat because there's only much psychology to go around. And connecting this class to, let's say, your 121 class or your learning class, or I don't know about abnormal psych, maybe a little bit, that would be elaboration. So connecting new information to old information. Okay? And what that does is it strengthens the encoding process because it adds more ways to get the information. So you can get to it from the old information, you can get to it from a new way. And the last thing on this slide is the no duh. I'm going to tell you that practice that is distributed across several days, across several trials, practice, 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 is better than cramming mass practice all at once. So you should distribute your studying across several days because that helps because there's more elaboration. More elaboration equals better memories. All right. And then another no duh sort of moment. We are better when we're paying attention. Big shock, right? So one reason that encoding might be poor, so getting from short term to long term, is that you're not really paying attention. Okay? So if you're distracted, encoding is weaker. And if you're trying to remember it, you're not going to. So this is why you really shouldn't study with the TV on or music unless it doesn't have words. Is that when the reason this happens is that your attention is divided between usually several tasks because you're distracted. And so when you have divided attention, the process of encoding is just poorer. And so trying to get that information back out, it's like trying to pick up something that's broken into a lot of pieces, and the pieces just don't want to stay together, and it sort of crumbles. Okay. So divided attention is bad, focused attention is good. Okay, so levels of processing. Levels of processing theory is a rather popular argument for encoding. I'm going to tell you why it's a rather bad argument for encoding as well, and then a little bit on the brain. So levels of processing theory is from Tulving as well. Is thinking about how some stimuli are remembered better than others. So we have got some memories that just seem to be, it's easier to learn them, they stick better, that sort of thing. And so one of the big problems with levels of processing is it's really incidental learning. And incidental learning is learning when you don't mean to. So think about it this way. I am studying for a test, and I know that this section's not studied, but I have to read it anyway. And so I learned sort of by accident. Now, how do we know that you learned by accident? Well, we ask you. But generally, the problem with incidental learning is it's sort of circular. How do I know it's incidental learning? Well, I wasn't trying. Well, but you remembered it. So how can I tell you weren't trying? Well, I just wasn't. So the issue with incidental learning is that it's very circular, the argument for it. They weren't trying, so because they learned it, it was an accident. Oops, sorry. So what levels of processing really gets at, because since my slide has disappeared here, is that deeper encoding is better. So what do I mean by deep encoding? Deep encoding is this idea that when you're processing a stimulus, you're using more elaborative processes. So if I ask you to remember a list of words, it will help if you think about what category they're in. So category processing is very semantic. It takes a lot of work versus if I ask you to process something based on if the letters are capital or not. Alright, so one of the problems with recording at home is sometimes your dogs have a desperate need for your attention. Alright, so let's go back to the notes here. I was talking about levels of processing. So mention that the deeper the encoding, the better. And so category, just thinking about categories makes it a deeper encoding. And then thinking about how the thing looks is a less deep encoding, more shallower encoding. So if you get asked, does this have capital letters? You are less likely to remember it than if I ask you, is a chair a piece of furniture? And you say yes. So the whole idea between both of these, incidental learning and levels of processing, is so circular. So how do we know that they remembered it better? Well, it was deeper encoding. How do we know it was deep encoding? Because they remembered it better. So what do you do to solve that problem of, yeah, the theory seems nice, but it doesn't really work? Now what we talk about is transfer appropriate processing and encoding specificity. Okay, these are slightly different things. So transfer appropriate processing is the principle that says that the way that you are processing it at encoding is most effective that when at retrieval you have the same processing. Okay. So if you want to study for an essay-based test, write essays. Because if you write essays when you're encoding, right, so we're moving it into long-term memory, the retrieval, I have to write an essay for the exam, needs to be the same type of process. So the way you processed it in encoding should be the same way you process it at retrieval to pull it back out. So in my example of categories versus capital letters, if I encoded it as a category, I'm going to remember it better if you ask me about categories. If I encoded it better as capital letters, I'm going to remember it better if you ask me about capital letters. Okay, so the process needs to match. Encoding specificity is about the things outside of you, stimuli. Okay, so we're better at remembering things when your mood is the same. Encoding specificity is the one that says if you study drunk, you should take the test drunk. That is true. I wouldn't recommend it because you still do poorly, but you do less poorly than if you study drunk and take the test sober. Mood, I already said. The room should be the same. All your surroundings should be the same. So you're getting the same cues. Transfer appropriate processing is really about the process of encoding, whereas encoding specificity is more about all the other stuff in encoding. So your surroundings, your mood, your feelings, that sort of stuff. Okay, so I'm going to give you the famous diver study. This is a encoding specificity study. So going across the top here is how they studied it. So they either studied a list of words on land or underwater, and then we tested them on land or underwater. So what happened is if I studied on land, I got tested on land, I did really good. Yay! If I studied underwater and I got tested underwater, I also did really good. Yay! If you mixed and matched, boo, not good. Okay. So this is sort of a classic study on encoding specificity, meaning that the test and studying and retrieval procedures should be the same. All right, there's my levels of processing slide. It's in the wrong place. But the idea is that for levels of processing, deep encoding, whereas there's a lot of elaboration, is better, and shallow encoding is not as good. So rhyming is sort of in the middle. Semantic encoding is supposed to be the best. So what about the brain and all of this? So semantic processing is better for you. And so what are we going to do to determine where in the brain that is? So if we're looking at different brain activations, what can we say is better? Or where, really? So what divided attention tasks do to you is they take that frontal lobe activation, remember the prefrontal cortex, which sort of does everything, working memory, attention, and it decreases your activation in that area because you're trying to do too much at once. And so when you have that decrease in activation, your episodic encoding goes down when you have a divided attention task. So intentional learning is learning that is purposeful, like unintentional is, or incidental is the non-purposeful stuff. And so when you have a divided attention task, episodic learning suffers. So you'll see that people have less activation in that left frontal lobe, up here in the front, when you divide attention. Sorry, this middle sentence here isn't so great. There's greater activation in the left inferior frontal and medial temporal lobes when you remember the words versus words that were later forgotten. Okay, so left inferior frontal is going to be a lower left frontal lobe, which is your prefrontal cortex. Medial temporal lobe is your hippocampus, which we've already talked about several times is important for memory. And those will show more activation when you remember a word versus when you're going to forget. Okay. So the middle piece here is saying that you get a decrease in left frontal activation when your attention is divided, which means you're probably going to forget. All right, so here's a pretty picture version. Here is your left inferior down here at the bottom. And so then the left lateral temporal cortex. Okay. Check out that medial temporal lobe. Right? And so you will get more activation in those areas when you remember. And you seem to remember much better and get more activation when it's semantic encoding. So this is support for semantic-based systems, because that perceptual coding, you don't get very much activation. So these are things you're going to remember better because you're getting more activation. All right, and so to sum all of that up, we have two memory-based systems, episodic and semantic, in the declarative memory side. So these are purposeful systems. There are several ways to encode. We talked about elaboration. Levels of processing, which we said is not very supported anymore because now it's more transfer-appropriate processing, and encoding specificity. And then lastly, we talked a little bit about where all of that is in the brain, and mostly it's not surprising in the medial temporal lobes, which is the hippocampus, and in the prefrontal cortex, which sort of does everything, especially attention. The next segment is going to finish the different encoding rules for long-term memory and look into how we can consolidate memories and hold them in memory longer.